Congratulations! You've completed the first module of this course. Let's recap some of the key learnings. In the first lesson, you discovered that user interfaces, or UIs, are graphical surfaces that allow users to interact with an app, making them integral to app development. You learned about the different categories of devices Apple offers: those that use non-touch interfaces and a mouse as a control, those that use touch interfaces and a finger as a controller, and hybrid devices. You also learned about the differences between them and the different operating systems used to run them. With touch interfaces, you learned that using space wisely is fundamental to creating a successful app. Remember, with UI design, less is more. You also gained insight into some unique challenges for iOS UI design. Also related to UI design, you were introduced to the Human Interface Guidelines, a document containing design guidelines for creating adaptable UIs that put the user first. Next, you learned about Xcode, the Integrated Development Environment, or IDE, for creating apps for Apple devices and some of its app creation tools, as well as how to install and set up the development environment. You explored Xcode in SwiftUI mode, learning more about the environment. Your second lesson began with an introduction to all things SwiftUI related. You learned that SwiftUI was launched in response to the problem of needing to create different controls for different Apple platforms that have different input methods using the graphical toolkits AppKit, UIKit, and WatchKit. Recall that SwiftUI enables you to create just one UI element and then determines how to adapt and display it on different platforms, making development for cross-platform apps faster and easier. You also discovered some of the other benefits of SwiftUI and explored app structure in SwiftUI and its architecture. You explored the difference between the approaches used by the graphical toolkits and Swift, imperative and declarative syntaxes respectively. You learned that whereas the imperative syntax method works by creating code by specifying exact orders, declarative syntax is a method of writing code for UI elements by specifying what you need instead of how you need it. Declarative syntax is a more modern approach to programming. You worked through the many advantages of declarative syntax. For example, that Xcode provides a live preview helping to develop apps faster, and that's the future for Apple platforms. You also learned about its limitations, including that the market is still adapting to SwiftUI. After that, you discovered the difference between scenes and views in SwiftUI. Scenes are a kind of container for other elements, such as windows or views, and views are more complex elements with properties you can define and can be reused in the same app or across apps. Almost everything shown on screen in SwiftUI is a view, such as text, images, and shapes. You explored these properties and how views can be combined to form rows, columns, or grids, as well as how to create and reuse a view, and even had the opportunity to set up a SwiftUI app. In the third lesson, you learned how to create variables that can be created in views, observed and communicated updates or changes. You explored this using the example of an app where a value is typed in a text field and a discounted amount is displayed in the text element, using a function to calculate the discount in variables to store the input value and final result. You learned about the property wrappers, state, and binding, as well as the observable object element and observed object wrapper, which work to observe and react to variable changes in different situations. You then gained greater insight into the differences between text elements and text fields and how to customize them. Recall that text is a view that displays text, whereas text fields allow user input. You were also briefly introduced to how spacing works with text elements and using the line limit modifier to restrict text to a maximum number of lines. With regards to text fields, you learned how to create a control variable and connect it to the text field. In a reading, you learned about some other modifiers available to you to apply to texts and text fields. In addition, you learned how to store text field inputs into control variables and detect changes to them as they happen, such as when a user begins editing the text or finishes editing, by adding the onChange and onSubmit modifiers to the text fields, or by using onEditingChange. Finally, you put this knowledge to the test by creating an app with a text element tied to an observed variable. Well done for working through all these concepts. Now that you've finished getting started with SwiftUI, it's time for a module quiz. Feel free to revisit any learning area before moving on. Looking forward to exploring the foundations of SwiftUI with you.